I'm Pastor Mark Buetow. This is another episode of Bible 101. It is Holy Week. Thursday night of Holy Week, to be precise. Jesus has just instituted the supper of his body and blood, given and shed for the forgiveness of sins, to be celebrated and received by his people until he comes again, as they proclaim the gospel that he died for sinners and rose again. And now, after having finished the supper, the Passover meal, and the institution of the Lord's Supper, they head out to the Garden of Gethsemane, which was a little ways outside of Jerusalem, where he and his disciples would often gather. Jesus told his disciples to wait for him while he went ahead a little bit and prayed. And he took Peter, James, and John with him, and then left them a stone's throw away, and he went off and prayed. And he prayed fervently. And here was the time when, remember when he was tempted, it says the devil left him until an opportune time. Now was a great temptation and sorrow that overcame Jesus because he knew what was coming. And he falls down and he prays. He says, Father, if it is possible for this cup to be removed from me, then let it be so. But not my will, but your will be done. Jesus was asking that he not have to drink the cup of the suffering of God's wrath for the sins of the world. But he prayed that he would not do what he wanted, but what his Father wanted. Here's a great temptation. If Jesus doesn't end up going through with this, we are doomed. If Jesus goes through with this, if he obeys his Father, then we will be saved. 3 times Jesus went back to check on Peter, James, and John, but it was late and they were tired and they had fallen asleep. He says, wait, can't you even watch a little bit? Stay awake. The flesh is willing, or the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. But they were so tired they kept falling asleep. And then we remember Jesus' words, watch, stay awake and be ready, because you don't know the hour that the Son of Man is coming. Here's Jesus about to fulfill his glory and suffer and die for the sins of the world, and his disciples are sleeping. 3 times this happened. 3 times Jesus goes back and he prays the same prayer. And then, even, the Bible says, he began to sweat drops of blood. The agony was so intense as he anticipated the suffering that he was about to undergo. After the 3rd time, Jesus says, well, I guess you're going to get some sleep, so sleep away. But now get up and let's go, because my betrayer is at hand. And about that time, Judas arrived, who, remember, had agreed for a price of 30 pieces of silver to betray Jesus so that the religious leaders, the Pharisees and the scribes and the Sadducees and everybody, could get their hands on him. So he knows the place where Jesus met with the disciples. So he shows up with a crowd armed with clubs and swords, and they arrest Jesus. And the sign of betrayal is that he would give Jesus a kiss. How ironic that he treats Jesus as his rabbi and friend, and yet that's the signal for them to grab a hold of Jesus. The disciples aren't sure what to do. Peter draws a sword and cuts off the ear of one of the servants of the high priest. Jesus ends up healing him and says, you live by the sword, you're going to die by the sword. And then eventually, as they grab Jesus, who says, listen, this is your hour, the hour of darkness. I could call down angels if I wanted to, but it must be this way to fulfill all things. And so the disciples end up scattering. And the prophet is quoted, says, they'll scatter like the sheep when the shepherd is taken, and the sheep scatter. And so Jesus' disciples all run off and abandon him, and the forces of the high priest and the religious leaders of the Jews, they've got a hold of Jesus, and they will drag him off for his trial. It's important to understand that what's happening here is what God the Father has planned for his Son, that he's going to be the sacrifice for sins. Jesus says, not sure I want to do this, Dad, but I will obey you, and I will die for sinners. And then comes his arrest in the garden, but this is all planned. Jesus knows this is going to happen to him. Like he says, he could call down 12 legions of angels to mop these guys up like nobody's business, and yet he doesn't. And here we see the great mystery of our salvation, that God, who has become man, goes willingly to horrible suffering and death in order to take away your sins. We'll pick it up next time in the courtyard in the palace of the high priest, as Jesus goes on trial, a sham trial with lies and false witnesses, and Peter's denial. I'm Pastor Mark Buetow. This has been another episode of Higher Things Bible 101.